So I'm just going to use my laptop as my notes, although I'm being projected over here. So just a second while I bring it up. And this title, I didn't actually create this at all. I think maybe Darien did, but I don't know for certain. But I thought that's a good title. I'm not going to worry about it. But then when I put it in my first slide, as you see, it actually then has a double meaning. So I think the idea was Franklinia's noble home is here on the Omaha or Fort Barrington, as you saw yesterday, but Bartram's Garden in some other second way is also the noble home and the place that protected and preserved the plant alive to this very day. Perhaps we can't absolutely definitively prove it, but perhaps all the Franklinia that are now alive descended from 5 plants William Bartram started from seed in spring 1777, when he returns to Philadelphia. So I thought I'd first just show you some pictures of a really good Franklinia, because I think most people probably, you see a photograph of a flower, which is not what you experience when you see a mature big Franklinia. And it happens for close to 25 years. I lived on Spruce Street in West Philadelphia near the University of Pennsylvania. And at the corner of 42nd and Spruce, there was and still is a very large Franklinia that's probably at least 100 years old. Could have been planted in the 1920s, could even go back to the 1880s or 1890s. And for maybe a year, I didn't even pay much attention to it. But then once I saw it blooming, and that was about the time I began going to graduate school, I'd done summer archaeology at Bartram's Garden. I'd heard about Franklinia, but probably never even saw a flower. Then I thought, what's this funny plant with all these big white flowers? And you see, this is a very mature, nice Franklinia, which is probably what the Bartrams saw at Fort Barrington, not the kind of often scrawny, dying little stick in the ground. It's about 30 feet tall. It's got a really big trunk down here and very big branches. Here's a close-up of the flowers. So when a big plant goes in flower, there could be 50, 75, 100 flowers every day, because it keeps rapidly growing. The flowers form on the new growth, and it rapidly puts out new growth. There's a view of the buds. The buds are beautiful. So this is a mid-July or August. The blooming growth forms these spherical buds, about the size of musket balls. These are the seed pods. So this is like the growth of 1 year. That's the old terminal bud, and those are the flowers from the fruits from the previous year, blooming what William Bartram's described as woody apples. And they actually, when they're green, do look a bit like a kind of stone fruit or an apple. And then in fall, it's absolutely beautiful. These purple-red mahogany color leaves hang on until maybe December, and then it drops off completely. So theoretically, down here in Georgia, it was also totally deciduous. And as you'll see, the Bartrams first see it in October of 1765. And it might have been the color that struck them more than anything else, because they, as you'll see, they say they don't have any, didn't find any fruit or flowers to really type the plant. So, John Bartram and William Bartram. We don't have any kind of a portrait of John Bartram. This is Howard Pyle, a famous artist from the Brandywine country, himself dressed up like John Bartram, but being a good botanist with a lens and looking at what looks like a sedge or something like that, which is not a usual plant that most people pay much attention to. And William Bartram, a portrait that was made by Charles Wilson Peale, 1808, and the descriptions say it was painted over breakfast at Bartram's Garden. Peale came out. It's not like a usual Peale portrait that's either on a canvas or a panel, but it's on paper, and then Peale pasted it onto a board, and it's on display in Philadelphia now. It's in some ways much more lively. Like a lot of the founding father portraits by Peale are overworked. There's some attempt to maybe make them look better than they were. This, because it was painted so fast, it might be a very lifelike portrait. And I must say that previous talk Darien did with the bearded Bartram, I've always thought he was bearded on much of his travels, even though we don't ever see him that way. So 1765 in the spring, John Bartram gets awarded a 50-pound a year pension from George III. And very recently at Bartram's Garden, we acquired this wooden box, leather covered. It once been embossed like, you know, a fine binding. There would have been gold leaf and all these insignias. And there are 4 diamond patterns that say GR. Those 4, that grouping of 4 with GR was George III's royal insignia. So what is this box? It's been held for over 100 years by Bartram descendants. It was full of silhouette portraits, nothing about what had originally been in it, but it's a locked box. Official insignias would have been gleaming oiled leather and gold. This is the way the British Empire talked to its colonies. Parliament and the Crown sent these what are called dispatch boxes with orders, decrees, parliamentary notices. So this is probably what was sent to Bartram from the Crown to say, hey, you've now got this pension for the rest of your life, 50 years, 50 pounds a year. So Bartram decides to go south to Florida. He, for a while, dithers over whether he can get to the Mississippi, go down to Ohio. He really wants to go to Mississippi, but in the end, he goes to Florida. And he makes a very long trip, which sometimes is included in the Bartram Trail Conference as one of the Bartram trips because William's with him. But then other times people only talk about what you get from travels. But John Bartram comes from Philadelphia by ship to Charleston. Then he goes up through coastal area by Lackawanna up to the Cape Fear River, where his half-brother had lived, but had died before this, but his son William was living. And they explore a bit of the Cape Fear River and Ashwood Plantation. They visit Lake Waccamaw. And this is all described, though one of the only really complete journals of John Bartram's travels that it survives is a draft version of the trip. Back to Charleston, up the Savannah River to Augusta, back down again. September 30th, they leave Savannah. October 1st, they find Franklinia. So only one day. They're traveling pretty fast. Or, yeah, that's one day. And then eventually down to St. Augustine, to St. John's River, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the other thing is William Bartram had this experience of going south along the same routes he traveled many, many times, as Brad showed earlier. Oops, wrong way. 8 years before he makes his famous solo trip. So here's a blow-up, courtesy of Brad Sanders, of where we were yesterday, Fort Barrington, the historic roads at that time, Darien. And if you can just make out, I had Brad shade this area because we don't really know exactly where Franklinia was found, or if there was only one location. There's now evidence, at least I would take, that there were at least 2 locations where people once saw Franklinia. And much, much later on in the 1840s, Hamilton Cooper says there was a 20-mile strip where Franklinia occurred. So this is probably a microfilm copy of John Bartram's diary, October 1st. You probably can't read any of it there, but what he says is, we missed our way and fell 4 miles below Fort Barrington, where we lodged this night. All these sentences are a bit ambiguous. Did they lodge below Fort Barrington 4 miles, or did they lodge at Fort Barrington? Depending on how you read that sentence, it could mean either. And also then he says, this day we found several various currant shrubs, one bearing beautiful good fruit. Everyone now assumes at least one of the very curious shrubs was Franklinia. And from William Bartram, we have some evidence, as you'll see, what the second one was. So William Bartram comes back, this very nice map, courtesy of National Geographic about 20 years ago, shows his major routes. But again, as Brad said, the first trip William Bartram makes when he gets down here is crossing the river at Fort Barrington in spring 1773. In the book Travels, in the very beginning area, after the introduction, maybe around page 15 or 20, I forget the exact page number, he introduces Franklinia there, and the plant he calls Bignonia bracteatea or Pinknia fever tree at that exact period. And I think he even says they're flowering. So the question would be, could Franklinia have flowered in April or May of 1773? Or is he conflating more than one period? We don't know. But he's definitely there at the right time. And these 2 drawings are sent to Fothergill either in 1773 or 1776. It's a little bit ambiguous there as well, but that's a field drawing of Franklinia in flower with an immature seed pod sliced open, the pistil or style, and a single unripe seed. sometime later, someone traced the right capsule from another drawing by William and wrote Franklinia down below it. But all William Bartram says is number 1 and number 7. That's a flowering branch of Pinckney with the sea pie and some descriptive text. And later in travels again, towards the back, William Bartram will describe and name Franklinia Latmaha and what he wants to actually call Bartramia bracteatia for his father, but later gets named by Michaud as Pinckney. So the best description of travels, Brad read a tiny bit of it, occurs in a very short chapter in Travels at the end of his traveling major area while he's still in the South, when he's gotten back from West Florida. There's this part 3, chapter 9. And if you haven't really ever looked closely at Travels, the chapters have boring number titles, but there is a table of contents that has descriptive paragraphs or sentences. And so this chapter has the contents title of Short Excursion in the South of Georgia, makes collections, gathered seeds of 2 new and very curious shrubs. So again, William Bartram and his father, John, used this term, very curious shrub, for Franklinia. And curious doesn't then mean what it kind of means to us now, which is quaint or weird or bizarre. It meant important, scientifically important, valuable. And I once did a digital search through Travels from the online documents of the South. I searched on curious shrub, and very curious. And there's only like a dozen things in all of Travels that are ever described as very curious. There might be 70 things that are curious. So that kind of means this is important, Kay, to pay some attention here. This expedition is probably summer 1776. It could even be a little later, because we don't know when would seed have ripened in Georgia from the Franklinia. In Philadelphia, the seed ripens in December. So more likely, I'm thinking it might even be fall, but shortly before he leaves the area of Darien and then goes to Savannah and then to Charleston and then heads north as he realizes the revolution is breaking out. So here's what he says, and you heard a little bit of it earlier. I had the opportunity of observing the new flowering shrub resembling the Gordonia, where he has an asterisk, in perfect bloom, as well as bearing ripe fruit. It is a flowering tree of the first order for beauty and fragrance of blossoms, and which we have honored with the name of the illustrious Dr. Benjamin Franklin. So here also comes a confusion as to who actually gave the name. Most people all across America think it's John Bartram who named Franklinia for Benjamin Franklin, but John Bartram never saw the plant in flower, never described it. It's William who did. And he starts the sentence with, I had the opportunity of observing, but then he says, which we honored. So he's constantly switching between just himself and his father, because all throughout Travels, he's trying to glorify his father and what his father had done before, which is largely being forgotten in the 1790s by the time the book comes out. And then he says, we never saw it grow any other place, nor have I ever seen it growing wild in all my travels from Pennsylvania to Point Coupé on the banks of the Mississippi. And we must be allowed a very singular and unaccountable circumstance. In this place, there are 2 or 3 acres of ground where it grows plentifully. So he gives a dimension, 2 or 3 acres, could be right, maybe, where it grows plentifully, which might mean a dozen plants, we don't really know. And then he says, and the other new singular beautiful shrub, now in full bloom, I never saw but 2 other places in all my travels, and they were sparingly, except in East Florida, in the vicinity, in the neighborhood of the seacoast. And he gave it the name Bignonia bracteatia extempore. William Bartram comes back, probably sowed seed that he collected in 1776 right away. And in 1781, his neighbor, William Young, who was a botanist, in a catalog that was published in Paris, of all places, this large shrub, and this is a translation of the French catalog description, this large shrub is about 20 feet high. It was discovered by Mr. William Bartram. I've seen it flower in the month of August 1781, when it was around 4 feet high. So that's the description of the first flowering in Philadelphia at Bartram's garden of Franklinia. So pretty successful. He sowed seed spring 1777, and within 4 years, it's flowering. And Franklinia has a very strong reputation for being an early flowering plant from seed. We have an interesting letter that was only discovered about a decade ago by researchers in Sweden, really looking into Linnaeus. And at the University of Stockholm archives, they found a folded sheet letter. This is 2 sheets of it, and you'll see the third back, and there's a blank piece. It's a long friendly letter to Carl Linnaeus Jr. 1783 is really the first year the Bartrams could trade freely with Europe, even send correspondence to Sweden. Letters from Philadelphia, Sweden could take 6 months to 3 years to arrive. Carl Linnaeus Jr. died before he probably ever received this letter, but this page is titled Monodelphia polyandria, #2. And it's a typical, very skilled botanic character of a new species: caudex, folio, flora, calyx, etc., stamens. It's in English, not in Latin, because William's not great with Latin. And then there's a description, which you'll see on the next page. And on the back it says there were illustrations that accompanied. #2 was illustrated with a detail of the flower and dissection of the seed pod. That drawing is lost. So there's a lost, very skilled 1782 drawing of Franklinia by William Bartram. But he says, this very beautiful shrub I discovered growing in Florida about 5 years ago, brought the ripe seed to Philadelphia. And from these seeds grew 5 plants, 2 of which were taken to France by Monsieur Girard, ambassador to these states, and were to be planted in the royal garden at Versailles. 2 plants here now finally in flower in the open ground perfectly resist our hardest winters. So we have some vague evidence that there was a Franklinia in the Botanic Garden section at the Trianon Garden of Versailles. But it's not clear if it's one of these original 2 seedlings or a later one. And then 1783, the same year as that letter, the Bartram brothers issue a big broadside catalog to introduce to the world, and particularly their customers who are in Europe, not in America, that they have the plants. They're kind of, the garden's owned by John Bartram Jr., William's younger brother, but they're also really playing on the reputation of their father. At the very bottom, William sticks in 3 undescribed shrubs lately from Florida, and those are his special discoveries. Philadelphus is the scentless mock orange. Alatmaha is almost certainly Franklinia, and Gardenia is actually what's now called Falderdelia as a genus, because the Bartrams wanted to name that for Alexander Garden. So, thing about Franklinia is it's very well documented for a plant. I mean, you can put together a kind of living biography of Franklinia because it's mentioned every year. I have a database of stuff I pulled together, mostly from things I found in files at Bartram's when I first started working there. There's probably over 350 references in this bibliography I have. And almost every known botanist in Europe in the 18th century or early 19th century wrote about Franklinia. It's published in Philadelphia, given the name Franklinia by a cousin of the Bartram, Humphrey Marshall, who's actually celebrating his 300th birth anniversary this year. And here's Marshall's text. Franklinia Alatmaha, again, class 16, order 5, Monodelphia polyandria. That's the classing William Bartram gave. And it says here, species 1, Franklinia Alatmaha, Bartram's catalog. So Marshall, at the very introduction to his book, says a number of new plants come from the Bartram family catalog, which is that broadside catalog you see, and he gives a good description of it, but an error. So in one of the first scientific publications of Franklinia, he gets the date wrong. Discovered and first observed by John Bartram on his researches on the Altamaha River, anno 1760. So that's 5 years off, and that gets repeated all over the place to this very time as the date when Franklinia was discovered. Then we have this very beautiful drawing, which you see all the time. It's on the cover of Catherine's new book that's coming out just recently from the Natural History Museum in London. They didn't give it to us free. We had to pay for it to use it. But Franklinia Alatmaha, beautiful flowering tree discovered growing near the banks of the river Altamaha in Georgia. This was sent in fall 1788 to a London Quaker, Robert Barclay, who you'll hear a little more about. It's actually a drawing of a plant flowering at Bartram's garden, not a field drawing or a wild drawing. But it's a very good drawing of the plant with the ripe seeds from the previous year, then the expanded open ripe seed capsule, and then the seeds over here. And he also sent a whole bunch of specimens. William Bartram sent, I think, a bound book of maybe 70 specimens to Barclay, as well as saying these are the last specimens I kept from my travels. Those are well preserved now at the Natural History Museum. This is considered the type specimen of Franklinia, but it's actually a clipping of a garden-grown specimen from Bartram's garden in 1788. So we don't have any wilds. Well, no, let's take that back. We do have a wild specimen of Franklinia, but it's from Stephen Elliott. So in the book Travels, Franklinia forms a bit of some of the opening descriptions of what the South is like and the wonder of new plants. And it's at the very end when he makes that special trip to collect it. Most people have seen Travels. It's got 8 very small illustrations and a map. No illustration of Franklinia, most people would think. But in recent years, thanks to the discovery of this ad, the librarian Jim Green at the library company discovered and sent this to me. He said, "You might find this interesting." And yes, just published, sold by Thomas Dobson, Bartram's Travels. This is January 4th, 1792 in Philadelphia. So the book was a subscription book, but there were also extra copies, retail copies that may have been sent unbound, sold unbound. The subscription copies were bound. And it says, you know, something of a title, price $2, which is the subscription price as well. And then nota bene, those gentlemen who may choose to have extra plates, 8 in number, may be supplied with them, either plain or colored. So this is the mystery and long forgotten story of the extra plates. So in rare copies of Travels, you find these 2 plates right in the front, right where he first encounters Franklinia and Hindia. There's a plate, engraved plate, big quarto-sized plate. It's folded into the book, colored sometimes, black and white sometimes, of Franklinia, and then of Bignonia bracteatea with William Bartram Dillon, James Trenchard's sculpt, other details. It's a very good engraved portrait of Franklinia. It may have been made as early as 1786 for the planned first edition of Travels, which failed, but Travels comes out in 1791. It's still maybe, I think, the first published illustration of Franklinia in the world. And in Catherine book, I had the great pleasure to have 3 things appearing in it. Much longer detailed history of Franklinia, a kind of summary catalog of William Bartram's art, and then a long book on a project we did for about a decade, looking for copies of Travels. So we found 6 copies of Travels with these 8 extra plates in them, which no one has really noticed, except maybe Joseph Ewan. Joseph Ewan, in a footnote in his big folio book, says, "Oh, at Cornell there's a copy with extra plates," but he thinks they're put in later and it's not part of the publication. But now, because they were advertised and bound into at least 6 copies, we know they were part, but they were the extra special deluxe version of Travels, and that never made it to Europe. So they've never been reprinted by anyone ever anywhere. But one of the copies, the one that is at Cornell, that's its binding, was sent to Robert Barclay, and it has Robert Barclay's book plate, which is interesting because it's a dove with an olive branch, and it says "Seed in Arma," give up arms. Barclay was a Philadelphia-born Quaker who's baptized as an Anglican, but is sent when he's about 11 to live with his uncle, whichever Barclay it was in, I'm forgetting right now, in London, who was one of the founders of the Barclay Brothers Bank. And so very rapidly, Robert Barclay became immensely wealthy from his uncle. And this is his copy of the plate of Franklinia, his signature. That's the earliest date we found, 1791, on a copy of Travels. And there's also a copy that William Bartram prepared for George Washington, who was a subscriber, but it's got an extra decorated binding with these 8-pointed stars, and there's George Washington's copy. Now, I think George Washington, not being a botanist, probably never paid any attention to this drawing, and no historian has ever looked through it to say, hey, it's got these 8 extra plates. But it was there in documentation if anyone had ever looked. So another description of Franklinia, a nephew of Humphrey Marshall, who published the first scientific description of Travels, was named Moses Marshall. He was a great friend of William Bartram's and the Bartram family. He visited them frequently in the 1780s and 90s. The Marshalls are lusting after Franklinia and don't really have one and can't collect one easily. But in 1790, summer of 1790, Moses Marshall goes to Western Pennsylvania, down the National Road a bit into the Shenandoah, down the Appalachians, and then across South Carolina or maybe Georgia into eventually to Darien, and then goes upriver to look for Franklinia because he'd been told by his kind of cousin, second cousin, William Bartram, where it was. And only recently have I discovered that there are letters that have been long known by Moses Marshall about that trip, mostly would say it was too hot and I found Franklinia, but all the cuttings and plants died. This account is much more detailed from a journal that's in Westchester, Pennsylvania, July 11, 1790. Above the fort, Fort Barrington, is a cypress swamp, and below on the river is swampy for a little distance. The river here is probably 300 yards of fresh water. Where the fort was is a piece of ground which has been enclosed. Where it had been closed is overgrown with grass, grapevine, and passion vines, which later are so plentiful that in walking, you crack some of the fruit, which is now nearly ripe on every step. About half after we reached there, about 60 or 80 perches from the river going into the left hand, I got a glimpse of a Franklinia. What he means by the left hand, I'm not exactly positive. And I don't know if he came by land or by water. I kind of think he came by water, but he has a horse. We much rejoiced upon going near it, and I found I was not mistaken. Searching for more trees of Franklinia, about an hour, though without success, our horses picking grass the whole while. Knowing the distance we had to return in a difficult way, I could not make much further search. Therefore, I came back where I first observed, collected what seeds I could in young plants, and searched a considerable distance, but could find only a single shoot with several stems, 15 or 20 feet. So Moses Marshall only finds a single freestanding Franklinia plant. He collects seed, which probably wouldn't have been ripe in July. So that's unsuccessful. He takes cuttings and maybe digs up a few small plants, but he later says to Joseph Banks, because of the heat of the summer, they lost most or all. But if you calculate those perches into modern feet, it's like 990 or 1,300 feet from Fort Barrington. So where is that? I guess you could plot it out and make an arc and search that arc. And so then later history of the Franklinia has largely been forgotten. People often say John Lyon last saw Franklinia in 1803, but we know Stephen Elliott dated a specimen that had to come from Fort Barrington to 1814. And then there's a long description by Charles Lyell, the famous botanist, natural scientist in Europe, in London, who was making his second major trip to North America. And in January 1846, he spends about a month with Hamilton Cooper at Hopeton Plantation, just down around here, exactly where I'm probably not sure. But in the book, there's a very important section, actually about 3 paragraphs, which I've excerpted here, but he's musing on extinction, which was then a controversial and not clearly accepted scientific view. And he says, in illustration of this principle, I may refer to 2 beautiful evergreens flourishing in this part of Georgia, species of Gorgonia or Franklinia of the Bartrams, a plant allied to the camellia. One of these I saw everywhere in the swamps near the Altamaha, where it is called Loblolly Bay, Gorgonia lazayanthus, 40 feet high and even higher, dark green leaves, covered, I am told, in the flowering season with a profusion of milk white fragrant blossoms. This plant has a range in the southern states, while the other, Gorgonia pubescens, Franklinia, often seen in greenhouses in England, about 30 feet high, is confined, as I'm told by Mr. Cooper, to a very limited area of 20 miles in its greatest length, the same region where Bartram first discovered it 70 years ago near Barrington Ferry on the Altamaha. And then Lyell has a footnote to the accurate page numbers in the book Travels. He is very familiar with Travels and was kind of following it in his American journey. This book is published the next year in 47 as Lyell's second travels, and a copy was given to Darwin, Charles Darwin, who was a good friend of Lyell's, and Darwin writes a great letter back to Lyell, loving the book. At one point he says, I wish I was a Yankee, which he means an American. But then he says, I was glad to see your remarks on extermination and the striking incidents of the tree of Bartram. So I find that a great quote. And I mean, Darwin was an omnivorous writer, reader, but in his copy of Lyell's book, he's both bracketed and underscored the text on extermination and extinction. So finally, the last unsuccessful attempt to look for Franklinia, or actually the first unsuccessful attempt to look for it. So Lyell is really there in the winter where there would be no leaves on the plant. He doesn't really clearly say he saw a Franklinia, although he did see Loblolly Bay. But 1880, Charles Sargent of New York and also the Honorable Arboretum at Harvard was commissioned to produce a census of trees. And he wanted all the American trees. And Franklinia was in all the lists and books of American trees, but no one had seen it except as a garden plant. So through Thomas Meehan in Philadelphia, a nurseryman who had worked at Bartram's, he contacts Henry William Ravenel in Aiken, South Carolina. After the Civil War, Ravenel was bankrupt, and Meehan in Philadelphia paid him to grow and collect Southern plants for him. So he got into the nursery business. Ravenel's diary exists and was published about 20 or 30 years ago. March 1881, I received 2 letters from Sargent with full instructions about the wood specimens wanted for the museum in New York, the Museum of Natural History in New York, and for the census work. That's from Aiken. Sunday, the 13th of March, Darien. I've been making inquiries about Gordonian possessions and have great hopes of being able to find it. Old Fort Barrington, where John Bartram discovered it about 150 years ago on his travels through South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. That's not quite right, because it's probably more like less than 100 years it had been discovered. And it was William Bartram who went through South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. So it shows that Ravenel didn't really know what a Franklinia looked like. He had ever read William Bartram's travels, but that doesn't really matter. But it's about 14 miles upriver. They know the site of Fort Barrington quite well. He mentioned someone Harry, who I don't know who that was. It could have been a relative. It could have been somebody hired. It could have been a black person that went with him to travel. I don't know. I'd like to find out who this Harry is. But anyway, Harry says that he can make arrangements to take me up there in a few days. This tree has not been seen, and no living botanist has ever found it uncultivated. And then finally, Saturday, the 19th of March. Yesterday, I wrote Sargent to prepare him for a failure of my efforts and stated fully the difficulty of finding an unknown tree without leaves, flowers, or fruit vessels to guide me in the search. But he persevered, and Harry made multiple trips through the summer. This morning, Harry, and then finally November, he comes back down to Darien, November 3rd. This morning, Harry and I left home about 5 o'clock. 8 o'clock in his buggy for a ride to Barrington, probably the same road we took yesterday. We reached the spot where I wish to make a close and exhaustive search for Gordonian pubescens. This ends my efforts to find this tree. Harry and I went in March last. He then went in June and July and September. Our expedition today is the 5th effort, and we are still unable to rediscover it. And from that event, and then Sargent writing about that in his Census of Trees, the kind of mythology of the lost Franklinia gets into the world. The lost camellia, there's a poem by a famous poet, The Lost Camellia of the Bartrams. But it was alive. It was alive in lots of places. And in 1882, Thomas Meehan in Philadelphia sent Sargent at Arnold 2 Franklinia that were grown, probably clones propagated as cuttings from the original Bartram plants. And so 1882, those get to Boston. They lived for many years, but then the mother plants died, but they were propagated. So there is still alive plant material in an enormous grove of Franklinia at the Arboretum that could be the genetic material that William Bartram brought back from the outlaw, but that hasn't been studied yet. So just a few acknowledgements. This all comes from other people's researches. Back in '86, John Bosman and George Rogers, I met George Rogers several times at Bartram Trail conferences and had some correspondence with him very late in his life. They published a very good article, This Very Curious Tree, despite years of searching and reaching the enigma of Franklinia, adored, indoors. So that was published in Tipularia. It's to this day, a very great article. The Marshall material was discovered by Bob Gutowski, who was the education director at the Morris Arboretum in Philadelphia, and he transcribed it. Information about the Stephen Elliott specimen I got from Albert Sanders at the Charleston Museum, and I saw it in Charleston about a decade ago. And Elizabeth Allen, Betsy Allen, who's written things about the Bartrams and been at some of these conferences, her dissertation just 2015 included a lot of correspondence between Robert Barclay and Philadelphia, all of which have been very helpful. And over the past 3 years in trying to prepare the final manuscript for Catherine's book, libraries weren't open, and so I couldn't go to see any of the original Barclay letters or the Moses Marshall letters. So I have to depend on all these other printed sources, and hopefully sometime this year I might actually finally see those letters for real. So that's a quick run through of what we know from actual historic fact about Franklinia in the vicinity of Darien. So thank you.